Executive Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer, Katie Smith.
It's nice to be graceful in these chairs, right? Welcome, Wei. Thank you so much. You know, I've been in the ethics space for a long time, and myself included, I'm probably one of the biggest ethics nerds. I just want to acknowledge that the amount of how humble you are and how gracious you are and the impact that you've made in the ethics and compliance space. I think we can all agree that we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You know, it's interesting. Our paths crossed the first time about 2 years ago, right after you joined the DOJ. And I feel like this is a bookend opportunity because at the time you had just joined and there was an air of excitement among us as to what you were going to do and how it was going to impact. So it's been really interesting to see the evolution over the last 2 years. One of the things that you commented this morning that really resonated with me was the idea of helping people in a vocation. And you know, I think about us as practitioners. Most of us don't grow up thinking, I want to be a chief ethics and compliance officer when I grow up. I don't know about you, but I wanted to be a spy.
That's very interesting, actually. And now she works for a data company.
I'm really good at keeping secrets, though. But I think, you know, although we don't think about going into the field, we somehow wind up here, whether we trip into it or voluntold. But it really becomes more of a vocation, and we stay because we enjoy it, and we see the bigger impact that we're really making an impact on the larger world and helping people. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start out by putting you on the spot. What are your personal values?
Honesty, consistency, and learning, I think, are some of the things that I feel has resonated with me. Is, you know, I like to see consistent. This is the reason why so much of my message was focused on the consistency between your words and your actions and your beliefs and your actions. It bothers me when I see inconsistent behavior, and so it's one of the things that I certainly strive for. And honesty, certainly something drilled into me by my parents ever since a young age. We were always told that it's okay if you make a mistake, but it's not okay if you lie about it. And then I think just the thirst for learning, whether it's learning a new data system or learning how to gut fish.
Which I just recently learned how to do. It's hard. All right, thank you. Now, so in your evaluation questions, and not guidance, because I know you didn't want to call it guidance. Actually, maybe let's start with that. So we've had lots of conversations the last 8 months about the Department of Justice evaluation questions. But within my peers, I hear people talking about how it's guidance. And I know you feel very passionately about that. So how do you feel about the use of guidance?
It was very intentional, even internally, when we started circulating that document, that we didn't call it guidance. And in fact, one of the colleagues actually jokingly said, it's not the non-guidance. So ultimately, now we call it the evaluation questions. The way I think of it, guidance tells people what to do. Questions invite them to think for themselves. And that's, to me, is a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. All right. So when you think about, I know in the questions there was a great amount of emphasis on policies and practices and procedures. And I know there wasn't specific weight with one section versus the other, but I've heard you speak other times about the emphasis on more than just having the policy, but actually integrating it deeply into your business. And that really resonates with us because we're talking about ethics at the center and how you can really make that impactful. So in your experience, do you have examples of companies that are getting it right, that have been able to take it from that pure policy to integrating into ethics at the center?
I have, and I'm going to put Kurt Drake on the spot. He is the best I have ever seen at actually putting that into practice. And I think, I will say that, again, remind everyone, my role at Justice Department was one that was to help the prosecutors. So only companies under criminal investigation would I ever see them. So if things really worked for you, you probably wouldn't be in front of the Justice Department. So I probably wouldn't see you. So it's rare that I would get to see a company that has it done really well. But that does happen from time to time. By the time company comes in, it's years after the misconduct had happened, and they've had time to actually remediate and really enhance their program. So in some cases, it's in those cases that we would occasionally get to see companies that actually get it.
So how can we flip that script? So when we look at the questions, there's some fantastic questions in there about how to evaluate your program, and it's really a roadmap. What's your advice to those of us in the room on how to take those questions and make it a positive thing and evaluate our programs ourselves?
I think the most important thing is that you really have to know your business. So one of the things that I usually say to people is, one of the first question I typically ask a compliance officer when they come in to present is, could you give me a 2-minute risk profile of your company? And by risk profile is basically show me that you understand where the risks are and why they're there. And it's a snapshot of where you need to pay attention as a compliance officer in this particular area. And I would say probably 60–70% of the compliance officers could not answer that question.
Really?
I actually, there are some startling examples. There was a large company, very large Fortune 100 company, that came in, and it was an FCPA-related issue. So we are talking about Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I asked her how many, what's the percentage of your employees overseas and also percentage of revenue overseas, and she could not answer either question.
Wow. So I guess that was a short conversation.
It really affected the credibility of the rest of the presentation, I would say.
Absolutely. So when we look at the investigation that the board of Wells Fargo published at the results of those, and then also in the evaluation questions, there's an emphasis on root cause. But in conversations that I've had with my peers is that there seems to be some friction between what the ethics and compliance team wants to do, from identifying, tracking, and reporting root cause, and then the legal team having a reluctance to capture that data because they fear that it's an admission of guilt. Can you give any guidance to us on how we could change that scenario?
I think this is where I hope the evaluation document can be helpful because, frankly, it puts it out there that the DOJ is asking you to do root cause analysis. So if you don't do it, you're just being willfully blind. Mm-hmm. So you can't say, I don't want to do it because I don't want to learn, because we have put it out there that this is what we expect you to do.
Okay. So I'm curious, I don't want to dominate Wei's time. I'm sure that there are some people that have burning questions in the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we have folks that have microphones and they can come around to see you. Do we have any questions right now?
By the way, I just want to mention I have a microphone thing in my back, so I'm not the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's just, it's a microphone thing. I'm now very self-conscious about that.
All right. Hello, my name is Dale Wetmore. I'm with Convercent. Wei, I appreciate your talk, particularly the part about showing that students were much more likely to get a tetanus shot if they were given not just a fear or an encouragement, but also how to get a tetanus shot. So this might be a tricky question for you. can you point to any particular company where a chief compliance officer has seen a similar dramatic increase because they gave their employees the how to do the right thing?
I can immediately say it's not necessarily a dramatic increase, but it was certainly one concrete example, and it was almost just like that experiment. When I was in-house, I actually got a report from a colleague in Indonesia. And Indonesia was a market where we actually were always a little worried that there was a low number of reports coming in, and it really shouldn't. It should be a market that had much higher number of reports than we were seeing. And at one point, somebody actually did report something that was of significance. And so I went to talk to this, I interviewed this guy as part of the intake, and I said, so what made you decide to report it? He said, oh, it's very simple. I went to a training, and the reporting email is right there. And so I said, is this the first training you've been to? He said, no, I've been to all these trainings, but this is the first time that email is right there. So I just emailed. So that was actually almost exactly like the experiment. I mean, all he actually really wanted, I mean, we had the training, hopefully in other ways also worked, in helping him identify what was, inappropriate and that he should report it. He just needed to know where to report it. And that information was just lacking before. Thank you. Yep.
Any other questions? I can't see very well. Is there? I see a mic guy running. I don't see a hand. All right, there we go.
Hi there, my name's Daryl Cornelius. I'm from the Convercent global family in Europe. I wonder whether you had any advice for organisations, or you could give us some thoughts on how organisations would measure the KPIs, the particular KPIs that they would measure their progress towards progress towards their goals in an ethics program.
Sure. I know Kurt has a session on that later, and he really is the master at this. So, but what I will say is, what I'm seeing is most companies are doing varied measurements to start with, and there's an issue about also knowing what to measure, because just like your actions reflect your values, what you measure reflects your objectives. So one of the common answers that I got when I ask companies about training is that I get the answer that says we have a 95% completion rate. That doesn't tell me anything other than you were able to make people go to training. And then, another answer that people typically give is that, 98% of our employees were able to pass that quiz at the end. Excellent, your people have short-term memory. Very good short-term memory, but that's really all it is. And so I think one of the things that people need to think through more is really what are the objectives that you're actually measuring against. So I remember posing this question about, talking about training to some compliance officers, and they said, well, then what do you think are good measurements for training? And I said, well, it depends on why you're doing the training. Effective at achieving what? What was the goal that you had set in the beginning? And I literally just got blank stares back, because clearly my interpretation was, in her mind, training was done for one reason: to show the regulators that you did training. And if that's your purpose, 95% completion rate would be the right answer. That would be the right measurement. But if you're, for example, training people on how to use a new process that you just rolled out, I think the better test would be actually testing breaches in that process 6 months, 12 months down the road. Because your goal is to actually make sure they learn to use this process and they use it properly. So the way you measure it is to see how many times that process has been breached. So if you get to a starting point, then you can actually, once you have a starting point as a base measure, then you can measure progress on top of that. But I think most companies are not even quite at the starting point yet at this point.
All right, looks like we have one in the center.
Hi, good morning. My name is
morning.
Anika Bradford, and I work for a global biopharma company. And our U.S. Affiliate, of course, we're exiting a CIA, as many pharma companies are. And we are going through that transition of shifting from the traditional compliance program to one where we're trying to incorporate ethical decision making. Can you speak a little bit to policies on how they're written? Because right now, some of the things mandated under our corporate integrity agreement, it was kind of defined how we should write our policies. But as we try to shift from do this, do this, do this, any thoughts on how companies, primarily in the pharma space, I guess, or just policies in general, how are you marrying the two? Because I think that's a struggle we're having on what they should look like.
So I should emphasize to those of you who don't know, corporate integrity agreements are typically entered into by the Department of Health and Human Services, not Department of Justice. And they do tend to go into fairly granular details about how things need to be done. I think that's not the approach I would have taken. So just to illustrate the point, how many people in this room are lawyers? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you have read the United States Constitution from beginning to end? Wow, that's more people than I've ever seen. That's still quite a minority. That's our nation's code of conduct. And I will say in almost all the other engagements where I've spoken and asked that question, almost no hands would go up. And especially when I emphasize that I'm not talking about the Bill of Rights, the entire Constitution from beginning to end. I have never met an employee who sits down and reads policies. I personally have never done it. I have never met somebody who's admitted to doing it. I think what really happens with most employees is that they learn policy by doing things and asking their colleagues. So to me, what is written in the policy is far less important than how that's actually experienced by your employees. I mean, think about the first time you joined your company as a new employee. You have to take a trip. Maybe because you're compliance people, you go read the policies, but most people, they would not, the first thought to them would not be, let me go on the policy portal, download the policy, read it, study it, and figure out what it means. That's not what they would do. They would turn around to their colleague or their assistant and say, I need to take a trip. Can you just make arrangements? So where it really matters is actually how that's implemented and played out. So the way I would approach policies is I would keep it as simple as possible. And you want to the few people who are willing to sit down and read your policies, you want that to be understandable and simple and straightforward, and lay out the principles, and really then spend the rest of your energy in actually building the procedures that actually make real the policies to people as they go about their day-to-day. That's my view.
Very interesting. Now, we've heard that we're in year 2 of a 7-year bubble of chief ethics and compliance officers retiring, a lot of movement within the space. If you had your crystal ball, what would you say is the future direction? 5 years from now, what does our profession look like? What does the ethics and compliance space look like with all the change that's coming up?
I have to say, I am not big on trying to predict the future. I will say that I will talk about what I hope the future will be. I do hope that we move more from the compliance emphasis to ethics emphasis, and not just in name. So just renaming the position title, that doesn't say anything to me. But I think it really is this approach of trying to understand and identify and make real the values of the individuals and of the organizations. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that I really would like to think that we're going towards a more data-driven route, where people are actually able to make good use of the data that may be available to them, and use that to really do some proactive, preventative work, and allow them to keep your fingers on the pulse, so to speak, to really get a sense of what's happening in your company. And that may not even be immediately a compliance issue, But this is where compliance can really play a critical role in the company in actually diagnosing a lot of problems or issues that before they come up, that may not be compliance issues, but are important company issues. And one of the things that I've always asked people at some of the workshops that I've led is, you know, when you go to your doctor or emergency room, they always do take your temperature, take your heart, you know, take your pulse and your heartbeat. So what are the 3 metrics that you would use to measure the health of a compliance organization? The medical profession's got it down. I mean, they got the blood pressure, the heart rate. What are ours? And that's, you know, those are initial diagnostic measures. They don't tell the whole story by any means, but they tell you immediately some immediate decisions to be made. I mean, if a person has no heart rate, that's one treatment. They have a rapid heart rate, that's another treatment. Then they have to go into the history of the person and the circumstances under which they are admitted into the hospital. But all of those come in to complete the picture. But right away, there are a few things, a few metrics that they need to know right away to decide which course of action to take. So what are those metrics for compliance and ethics? And that's something I think we're still trying to figure that out.
I agree, absolutely. Yeah, so maybe we can we'll all work on that together. That would be fantastic. And any other questions? There's one straight in the center.
Hard to see from here.
Hi, Brianna Rice with On Semiconductor. You talked about the conduct at the top. I'm wondering, throughout my studies and being in the professional field, I've come to recognize something of the mood in the middle. Can you talk about how top-level executives can instill that in middle-level management?
So I often turn that question back to the audience, but this audience is too big, so I will start off by saying that this is the kind of question that you want to ask when you join a company. So, you know, how do I know this CEO that I'm working for or this GC or whomever is actually committed? And how do I know this person is acting as a leader? And so I would say, you know, I'm back to the theme of consistency of words and action. And I think all of you have seen leaders who get up and say things that you don't believe for a minute that's what they meant. You also have known leaders who don't say a word about something, but you know they're really committed to it. And that exhibits itself differently, but I think the only way to generalize that is to say you watch the choices they make. The times that they walked away from a deal because it was just not the right thing to do. The times where they decided to make the hard choice of allocating resources to a certain function when there is not a lot of resources to go around. The time when they choose to invest their own time in making sure they understand what's going on in the company, as opposed to just, you know, going about their normal busy lives, as opposed to really carving out a time, sitting down with certain stakeholders and say, now tell me honestly what's going on here, what do I need to know? It's those choices that they make that demonstrate their commitment, and people see that. And even people who are not right next to them see that, because those words get around. I definitely have heard people come tell me, they would say, well, so-and-so really cares about this because, you know, he's asking me about it all the time. So it's those actions, I think, speaks more than anything else.
Good morning. Stephen Cheeseman with HSBC Bank. You traveled globally, worked globally. This is a great event, a very first world event. How do you balance what I call cultural values that pop out? Chinese, the EU, South America, because compliance means something very different in Venezuela than it does in New York, than it does in parts of the EU. For global companies, how do you find that balance?
I think, you know, that That is a very difficult, that's a very difficult task, and one of the things that I try to do is to actually appeal to what is innate in the native culture. There is, at least I'm not aware of any culture in the world that actually as cultural values sanction misconduct that we commonly think of, the kind of misconduct that involve lying, cheating, and stealing. So every culture has its own expression against those behaviors. They may come out differently, but I think what's important is you actually drive to the core of what was in their cultural belief, in their cultural traditions, what are some of the manifestations of those values. And then you really, then it's a process of actually honest conversations with these employees about, then you've got these values, we've got these values, they manifest themselves differently. Now let's talk about how we can actually work with each other in a way that is consistent with everybody's values. I think ultimately it comes down to the person, and by appealing to what they're familiar with, and I think there is something to draw from in every culture, is where I would start. This is definitely not a silver bullet. It's something that takes a lot of dialogue, a lot of work, and enormous amounts of frustration, but that's where I would start.
It's not easy. It's not easy, I know that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We had one in the center up here. Here we go.
While we're waiting for that, let me just make one more comment following up on that. So I was in Europe a couple weeks ago, and one of the most interesting things was in Paris. From the moment I arrived to the moment I departed, well, all I heard was American legal imperialism. And why are Americans prosecuting our companies? And you know, it was, so I know from talking to some of you that you've heard similar type of sentiments from your foreign subsidiaries. And so I want to share with you sort of the answer that I gave them. So one was that there is a natural bias for people to pay attention to what happens to them. So the French will pay more attention when French companies are prosecuted. That doesn't mean other companies are not prosecuted. They just didn't know. And I'm not saying they need to know, but they didn't know that. But that's a natural bias, but nevertheless a bias that they need to recognize exists. So I named several other cases to them that they have never heard of. And I said, of course you haven't heard of them, because these are companies that have nothing to do with France. They don't operate in France. They have nothing to do with any of you in this room. And of course, your press would not cover it, and you would not hear about them. And the other thing that I do try to bring out is the prosecutors at the Department of Justice. I find it interesting to hear the image that people have of them. These are really smart people with common sense and strong integrity. And many of them are immigrants. Many of them, immigrants and children of immigrants. They are not people who are American imperialists. We had recently an FCPA trial in Southern District of New York, and it was the former Minister of Mines of Guinea who literally took bribes and sold his country's natural resources out. The prosecutor, the lead prosecutor from the FCPA unit was born in Ghana, and she has experienced corruption in a very personal way. And she saw an African country being essentially completely sold out by its own minister. And the second point is no one else is stepping up to the plate. Not the French, not the Ghanaian government, no one else is stepping up to the plate to right this wrong. So the United States did it, and she did it, but this is not at all, in my view, American imperialism. This is actually trying to do justice.
Do the right thing.
Right.
Right.
So those might be interesting. We have prosecutors who were born in Germany, Ghana, Uzbekistan, India. This is not a very sort of homogeneous group of prosecutors. There they're actually really a wonderful group of human beings and very diverse.
That's fantastic. So we did have a question. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Mark Le, I live in Europe and I mainly advise companies in Europe on their compliance program. This might sound a little bit provocative, but I will go ahead with it.
That's fine.
Well, I think I heard also this said this morning, we all aspire that business is taking more accountability for compliance, that senior management show a better example of behaviors that would support the values.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Yes,
Yes,
sorry.
thank you.
I'm saying I heard discussion this morning going around making sure that management takes accountability, that the business take accountability for compliance and show and display behaviors that support the values and so on. Don't you think there's a little bit of a disconnect with the fact that we talk about a compliance program, that we talk about a compliance training, this is your compliance moment, or in ethics, integrity, and don't we do ourselves as compliance officer a bit of a disservice by putting a silo organization, a silo that aspire to be better integrated by the definition, the words we're using, and by doing training just on compliance topics or risk assessment just on compliance topics, kind of in contradiction. So what's your view on that? Thank
you for raising that. This has always been a dream of mine, is that if I were with a company, I want to be able to tell people we have no compliance training. That's always been something that I wanted to do, was to be able to tell people that in our company, we do not have compliance training. All of our compliance is integrated into all the other trainings that we do. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because that's something I've always felt was a disservice. Because, for example, salespeople, they do their sales training that teaches them how to sell. And then you have an antitrust training, you have an anti-bribery training, you have all these bunch of other compliance trainings that are sitting out there that are essentially how not to sell. Why can't you integrate the how to sell and how not to sell together and have them learn it together in an integrated way? And I think that's actually true of almost all of the compliance training subjects and compliance work that we do, because one of the things that's unique about compliance work is that it does touch almost every part of the company. So to me, separating that, I agree with you. It does actually, to me, also takes away from my credibility as a compliance officer, in the sense that I'm just asking them to do one more thing. And that just becomes one more task that they have to complete. If I can actually integrate all of that into everything else they're already doing, then I'm actually a value add, as opposed to some extra thing that they have to do. So I completely agree with you, actually, that it needs to be far more integrated. One of the things that Andrew Weissman, the former head of the fraud section, well, he still is the head of the fraud section, but he's detailed to the special counsel's office. So when he worked for Robert Mueller at the FBI, he always said, Mueller would have these quarterly meetings where all his direct reports are at the table. And to his right sits the compliance officer of the FBI. The compliance officer does not own any of the tasks that's actually sort of listed for, and the compliance officer's job is to evaluate how everyone else is doing on those tasks. So before coming into the meeting, the compliance officer would have rated how each of the departments is actually performing in their compliance area, things that need to be done, are they in progress, are they not done? He rates them in red, yellow, green color codes. And as Andrew likes to say, if you are a task owner or a function head that has a red, you might as well not come to the meeting. You should just pack your bags and go home, because you will be fired. If you have a yellow, God help you, because you better have a really good explanation. But the compliance officer in this scenario is not an owner. The compliance officer is actually the evaluator of how compliance is working throughout the organization. And that's a model I would really like to see more of.
Great. Well, Wei, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great
Thank you.
conversation. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much.